Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 essential Orientalist masterpieces for beginners. In other words, music in which Western composers are evoking the mysterious East. And these are not operas. There's a difference because I can do a whole different thing on Orientalist operas, and we may. If you guys like this list, I'll definitely do more of similar type in other media. But for now, we're talking about orchestral music, keyboard music, things like that, chamber music, and it's really a wonderful collection of pieces. This is so much fun. It really is. We've had some talks recently about, cultural appropriation and all the nonsense that, the crazy wokeists talk about, the inability of doing music where, Western composers are trying to create, some sort of image of the East and how it was imperialist and colonialist and all that crap, which is frankly what it is. May have been imperialist and colonialist, may have been. But that really doesn't matter. I would say artistically, what matters is whether it's great music and a wonderful piece. Someone wrote recently about a performance of Dilib Lakme that was done with, because it takes place in India, with Gandhi, who has no part in the opera. Obviously, it's about the daughter of a high priest who's in love with the British soldier, and he goes back to his duty, and she kills herself, and it's all about, so they have quotations from Gandhi and things. It's just horrible, absolutely horrible, ridiculous, irrelevant nonsense. This is simply reflecting the, I think, very respectful attitude of Western composers who are looking for material that they could use to create fabulous music. And the fact that they wrote masterpieces, we're not talking about trash here. We're not talking about exploitive nonsense. We're talking about musical masterpieces inspired by Asian or Far Eastern culture. I mean, doesn't that justify the effort? I mean, really? Why would you criticize that? Yeah, okay. So there we are. It's all nonsensical, and we're instead going to sit back and just enjoy this unbelievably fabulous music that the people who wrote it took really, really, really seriously, and the sources which they treated, generally speaking, very respectfully. We begin with Rimsky-Korsakov, the ultimate, iconic Orientalist masterpiece, Scheherazade. Now, this is based on, 1001 Nights. So it's not, all the way to the East. It's more like Middle East. But it's pretty Eastern. It's exotic sounding. It doesn't use any Eastern musical materials. It's just inspired by this fabulous collection of stories. And it's, well, most people know it. If you don't know it, well, boy, are you in for a treat. Gosh, it's gorgeous. Each movement, it's essentially a symphony in 4 movements, each movement, representing a story told by Scheherazade, who is the solo violin, to her sultan, to entertain him for 1001 nights so that he does not put his wives to death. And of course, she succeeds, and it works wonderfully well, and so does Rimsky-Korsakov. Rimsky-Korsakov was, in a way, the ultimate Orientalist composer, because most of his operas are based on fairy tales. I mean, fairy tales from, the Far East. And so because they're fairy tales and they're based on that subject matter, he invented all kinds of evocative sounds, Tsar Sultan and the golden cockerel and Mora and Sadko and all of these things were all based on these sort of Arabic cultures. But, and also I have to say, there's something a little bit, I would say hypocritical about people complaining about Russian music using those sources, because Russia goes all the way to Vladivostok, and Eastern materials are just as Russian as Western materials. They were always balanced between the two. So Russian music that does that, I think, has a certain tinge of authenticity. There's also Balakirov's Islami, for example, and all those other pieces, but that's not in this list, so forget I said it. Then we've got Ravel, Mother Goose, the ballet. Now, the Mother Goose Ballet is about Mother Goose, but there is in the middle of Mother Goose a sequence, a number called L'Éternelle Impératrice des Pagodes, which is ugly little empress of the pagodas. And it's a pentatonic, that's 5-note scales, right? That we know. Totally deliciously scored, and a wonderful, wonderful Eastern portrait in a series of vignettes. There's some of them are other, Mother Goose stories. There's the fairy garden, and then there's what's his name, and who should call it, and Tom Thumb. There we go, Tom Thumb, and some other things like that. So you've got these fairy tale evocations, and one of them is an Eastern one, and that's a common recurring trope in Western music when you have a sequence of things. I mean, you think of the Nutcracker. No, not the Nutcracker. The Nutcracker. There we go. Where you have the Arabic dance and the Chinese dance, but you also have the Spanish dance, and a series of national dances. And, if you're doing a series of national dances, there's no reason why the Asian ones are culturally appropriative, where the Spanish and French and Italian ones are not. If you happen to not live in those countries, but you're doing them, you're just evoking styles. And that's what Ravel does here quite wonderfully. Then we have Colin McPhee. Here's a real treat, especially if you're a beginner. It's called Tabuh-Tabuhan. Now, Colin McPhee was a 20th century Canadian composer who spent most of his career, a great deal of his career, in Bali, in Indonesia, studying Indonesian gamelan music. And actually, most of what he wrote evokes Indonesian gamelan music. He didn't write a lot. He had some alcohol problems and other issues. But Tabuh-Tabuhan is for 2 pianos and orchestra. And the whole thing is a giant impression of gamelan music as recreated by the Western Symphony Orchestra. And it's absolutely glorious. It's so much fun to listen to. And it actually evokes some of the minimalist music that would later happen in the 60s and 70s. But oh my goodness, it's a great piece. And it's been recorded numerous times. It's easy to find, and you really owe it to yourself to hear it. One of McPhee's pals was the British composer Benjamin Britten. And Britten was also extremely strongly influenced both by Japanese no drama, Japanese opera essentially, and also by Balinese gamelan music. And it starts showing up very regularly in his works from about the middle 1950s onward. One of which is his full-length ballet, which is as good as unknown for most of its life, The Prince of the Pagodas. Get it? Pagoda. That's the Asian influence. It's a wonderful, colorful ballet full of great tunes and exotic music and stuff. And it may be because it's gamelan influence that it doesn't get played that much because of the appropriation thing or something. I don't know. But it's a wonderful piece, and it's Britten's largest piece of purely orchestral music. So if you like Benjamin Britten, if you like the 4C interludes from Peter Grimes, for example, or the Sinfonia da Requiem, or the Young Person's Guide for the Orchestra, Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, whatever it's called, you really should hear The Prince of the Pagodas. It comes in a suite, which is very nice, but the whole thing has much more of the gamelan music in it, so it's more enjoyable for me. Then we've got Lou Harrison. Lou Harrison is an American composer, 20th century composer. He died, about 10, 15 years ago, fairly recently. It's now 2025. And his immersion in Eastern music was completely total, 100% respectful. And he was the ultimate cultural fusion composer. He really was. And he wrote a ballet called Solstice. It's a chamber work. It's actually, I think, a septet. It's written for, there's an oboe and a trumpet and a couple of cellos and a bass and a tack piano with thumbtacks stuck in it. So it sounds kind of like a cross between a harpsichord and some sort of harpsichord and a celesta. It's very exotic sounding. The music is Asian flavored, but you don't know from where. It doesn't use any Asian music at all. It's just that the ethos, the way that he conceives of the music, it's simple melodies under ostinato rhythm accompaniments. It's obviously of that type, but it's completely original at the same time. The melodies are original. The sound is original. It's an amazing piece of music. And you really ought to give it a listen. I think you'll fall in love with it. I did the first time I heard it, and I play it constantly. It's wonderful to relax to. Tremendous fun, just tremendous fun. And there's a lot of Lou Harrison. He created what he called an American gamelan based on, brake drums and garbage cans and pails and things. He put together a whole percussion orchestra, for which he wrote a tremendous repertoire of works. He's totally universal in his outreach. He set choral works in Esperanto. So that shows you where he was coming from. Really a fascinating and important 20th century musical voice. And Solstice will really knock your socks off. So after Harrison, we have Alan Hovhaness. Now, Hovhaness was Armenian. He was born in Lowell, Massachusetts. He was American as can be. He was from Massachusetts. And he wrote, I don't know, I think 70 some odd symphonies or something, just tons and tons and tons and tons of music, a lot of which was extremely Asian influence. He actually studied Korean music and wrote a wonderful work based on his studies called Symphony for Metal Orchestra, which was recorded by Koch and features me on the tam-tam. I actually am on that recording with the Manhattan Chamber Orchestra. But the piece that I want to mention is the Fantasy on Japanese Woodprints. It's not one of the symphonies. It's actually a concerto for xylophone and orchestra, believe it or not, or something similar to that. And it's a remarkable work, wonderful and enjoyable, and totally different from anything you've heard. Again, Hovhaness was a composer who truly absorbed these influences and treated them with enormous respect. His wife was Japanese. There wasn't any colonial imperialist BS in his music at all. Some people think that he was way too prolific and that the quality of what he did suffered as a consequence. And that's a different story, really. But he's a composer worth getting to know. His most famous work is his second symphony called Mysterious Mountain, which is really, really, really beautiful. Fritz Reiner made a famous recording of it for RCA with the Chicago Symphony. It's absolutely gorgeous. Then let's go to England, back to England with Holst. Holst, he did the planets, but Holst actually wrote quite a bit of orchestral music, and some of it's really interesting. People don't know he wrote a Japanese suite, but I think maybe his choral hymns from the Rig Veda and Sanskrit, and they're in English, but he translated them from the Sanskrit, and his opera Savitri, which is an Indian story, and all this very, very interesting Asian music. He was fascinated by the East. He studied very seriously Asian culture and Asian music. And one of the pieces that was the result of all of this was Beni Mora, it's called. It's a 3-movement suite that's just wonderful and never gets played. Well, it ends quietly, I guess, but who cares? It's really terrific. And if you're looking to hear some Holst beyond the planets, beyond that one piece of his that everybody listens to, try Beni Mora. You will absolutely love it. It's fantastic and colorful and just brilliant. He always had a wonderful gift for orchestration, probably because he was a trombonist. So he was interested in instruments beyond the violins, giving everybody something good to do. So try Beni Mora. You won't be sorry. Then we always have to talk about Debussy, because Debussy was the iconic Orientalist composer. He didn't really write any one thing in that style, but he included things like that in many of his works. And the most famous probably is the piano piece Pagodas for solo piano. It's from the piece from the suite Estampes sketches or prints, pardon me, Estampes or prints. Number 1 for solo piano. It's part of a suite of three separate works. He also does Goldfish, Poisson d'Or, and things like that. These are wonderful programmatic pieces, and the East often creeps in because his musical style naturally incorporated Eastern musical modes, pentatonic themes, 5-note scales and things from the East. Whether or not the music was obviously evocative of that particular location or musical idiom, it was just part of his language. And he made it part of his language, but sometimes he used it to actually illustrate its original topic. So Pagodas for solo piano. I mean, it's only like, 3 minutes long, 4 minutes long, something like that. And it's just so beautiful. It's so wonderful. It's magical, absolutely magical. And that's, of course, why Western composers love that music, because it was fabulous and they could do fabulous things with it. Sticking with the piano, there's Leopold Godowsky, the great piano virtuoso / composer from the early 20th century. He wrote something called the Java Suite for solo piano, which is also based almost entirely on Balinese music, on gamelan music. It's for solo piano. Godowsky's music isn't terribly well known. He wrote really crazy, virtuoso, difficult things that were considered, really his specialty, actually. The most famous are his studies on Chopin's etudes, where he takes Chopin's etudes and makes them even more etudinous by combining them or playing them with one hand. And he does all kinds of crazy stuff to try and adapt them to transcendental, virtuoso 20th century piano technique. The Java Suite is a bit more normal, and it's wonderful. It ought to be better known. It has a whole pile of movements. There's a lot of music in it. It's like an hour or maybe a little more. And sometimes excerpts from it get played and they show up on various recordings. But the whole work is really extraordinary. And one of the great Orientalist masterpieces of piano music. And, one of the things I do want to point out is that a lot of these works, I call these essential works for beginners. And sometimes people say to me, oh, well, that's not beginning stuff because that's not the stuff that beginners will have heard of. Well, that's not my point. I don't care whether beginners have heard of it or not. I care that it's the best music. I mean, that's the point. The point is to give people who are getting started an unprejudiced view of a body of work. So you don't have to only go for the most famous things, and it doesn't have to be something that you've already heard of or someone else has told you about. I mean this very seriously, particularly if you're just beginning. You have to just jump in, get your feet wet, and try stuff and listen to things. And you never know what's going to really turn you on until you listen to it. So I put these lists together as essential lists for beginners because I really believe that they will give beginners a wonderful repertoire of material to explore at your leisure. And that's the idea. So do not worry that it's not like everything you've heard of that's the most famous thing in the world. It's not like the Chinese dance from the Nutcracker. Sure, go listen to the Nutcracker. It's got a Chinese dance. But these other pieces, I think, have so much in the way of musical originality and captivating ideas that they'll make a wonderful place to start if you're exploring this particular avenue of musical inspiration. So last but not least, oh my goodness, Mahler. Yes, Mahler, Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth. It's a symphony / song cycle for tenor and alto or baritone. Most of the time it's an alto. And large orchestra based on Chinese poetry. And oh, what a beautiful work it is. It's full of bittersweet longing and regret and alcohol-fueled ecstasy and craziness and hallucinations and loneliness. And the last movement, which is half an hour long, it's one of the longest songs anybody ever wrote. It's called The Farewell. It's haunting beyond belief. It really is. And the poetry is set in a way which is so subtly satisfying. There is that Chinese element, the pentatonic tunes. For example, especially like the third movement, these little hints, subtle hints of Asian music flits through the orchestral texture often, but not in a way that sounds in any way cheesy or tacky or exploitive. It's all just pure expression, but expression of emotion that's somehow distanced. It's a little bit of a far-off, exotic thing, while at the same time, the music is so powerful. And there's a universality to the way Mahler and all of these composers actually, but the way Mahler particularly handles his Orientalist elements, the pentatonic scales. For example, in the middle of the farewell, it begins with a tam-tam, a gong, pwang, where you have this really fabulous, simple device that transports you to another realm. But there's a big orchestral interlude in the middle. And the interlude in the middle is vintage Mahler. And somehow these Asian influences, he uses a mandolin and all of this, pentatonic, 5-note oriental scales, morphs into Mahler himself with his Jewish klezmer roots and it becomes this unbelievably soulful Slavic, but it's all part of the same thing. And it just goes to show, in concluding with Das Lied von der Erde, the point I want to make is that music is universal. It belongs to all of us. All of it belongs to all of us. And it's there to be used and to inspire and to satisfy us in an emotional way. And wherever composers get their materials and however they use them, the only thing that matters is whether or not they create masterpieces. And these composers did. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Enjoy these Orientalist masterpieces and take care.